Howdy, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Okayest Trapper podcast. We are brought to you by Mountain Tough Fitness, Blokes Modern Men's Health, and the Trapline Beard Oil Company. Go check out the links to all of these companies in the show notes and use the promo codes to get some sweet discounts to stay in shape, reclaim your health, and to keep your beard smelling better than your favorite skunk-based lure. Now, today's guest is a trapper, a hunter, and an artist. His work has been in every fur fish game magazine since 1987, and he's been a regular contributor to the Trapper and Predator Caller and the American Trapper magazines for decades. He's worked closely with popular trappers such as Tom Miranda on different book projects, and he's even been featured in galleries across the U.S. Joe Goodman, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm pretty pumped. You know, you and I have gone back and forth a little bit, and
Sure.
I've had multiple people recommend me to you. I've seen your artwork, unbeknownst to me, all over the place, having been a new trapper, picking up Fur Fish Game magazine and other stuff. And
Sure.
It's pretty awesome to be able to actually sit down and chat with you. So I appreciate you taking the time.
I'm glad to be here.
Now, the first question out of the gate that I ask everybody, what is your first core memory of ever being exposed to trapping?
There was a friend of ours. I grew up in a small town in Northwest Ohio, and we went to visit. My mom and dad were involved with a local little small town bowling alley, and one of their friends was having a little party. And so we pulled in, and one of the sons said, "Hey, what are you doing? You want to go check traps with me?" And I didn't even know what that was.
How
And
old were you at this time?
oh gosh, I don't know. I might have been pushing 10, going on 8 to 10. And he had it was summertime, and he had some groundhog traps, and he had caught a groundhog. And so I got to watch him see how that worked, and he kind of showed me how the trap operated, and got a groundhog and started looking into it, and decided, hey, this is kind of cool. And a couple years later, my dad told me, he said, well, I used to trap when I was younger, and if it's something you want to do, maybe we can go out and try to trap some muskrats. So I got introduced to reading Fur Fishing Game magazine, and I was hooked.
Wow. So if you don't mind me asking, what year was this when you and your dad decided to kind of potentially reopen his old traps and go out and
Yeah,
chase the muskrat?
I'm going to say early mid 70s, 74, I imagine. No, I'm 72 maybe. I was 12 when I really started getting into it. And he worked third shift. He built tires for Cooper Tire in Findlay. And so he would get off in the morning, and we'd go out and check traps. And we, uh, we had this area called Marsh Run outside of our town of Bluffton, Ohio, that was just loaded with muskrats. And we made some cage traps, and we had some number ones and some stop losses, and we did very well. And during that time, muskrat and raccoon, you got occasional coon or mink that were really paying well. And it's just something that I really took to heart, and couldn't get enough magazines to read, and really jumped into it with both feet.
Well, it's funny, I've talked to so many folks who started trapping during that fur boom, where maybe their parents who had trapped earlier but had taken a break, but then fur prices went back up. So, was there a little bit of ulterior motive too with your dad, like with the fur prices? Like, was it a good thing? Like, hey, I can do this with my son. But were you guys actually able to pull in enough muskrats to actually make a pretty penny on it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, 400 or 500 bucks the first season we did, and I mean, rats were going to 10, 15 bucks a piece back then in the 70s. That was decent money. Coons were 30 to 40 bucks. Mink probably high 20s. And what my dad never did, though, he was always a water trapper, and I wanted to learn how to catch fox. So I started. My first book I got was Russ Carman's fox trapping methods, and really that was kind of the Bible for me. And I ended up getting Gerald Weiland's long line fox trapping issue 1 and 2. Read those, and Dad said, "Well, those fox are kind of tough to catch, Joe." And I remember the first season opened, and I had a 10-speed bicycle put on my backpack basket on the back, and I rode out to a small farm we had permission to trap, and I only had 3 traps, and I made 3 dirt holes, rode home. It was Friday night. Football game was on, so I went with a couple of buddies to the football game, and we got out of the game. It was dark. I'm like, let's go check those traps, and it hadn't even been a few hours. So I went in. One of them was clicked off, and the other one had a possum in it. So I had one remaining good set for me and my dad to check in the morning, and he dropped me off and kind of went around the town block, and I walked back in there and I heard a trap chain jingling, and I looked up and it was a gray fox in this trap, and it was just real frosty. It was a cut soybean field, and I'll just never forget it as long as I live. And I dispatched it, and my dad was kind of going circles in the old we got a blue Ford Falcon of all things. This is going way back in time. And I walked out to the edge where he had dropped me off, and I laid that fox down in the tall weeds next to me. So when he come driving up to pick me up, he thought that I was skunked.
Mhm.
And I reached down and picked that fox up by the hind leg and held it up and shook it. And I remember him looking, and he just like, I can't believe it. I can't believe it. I can't believe it. And we ended up driving that fox around my small town of Bluffton most of the afternoon, showing off friends and family that here this country boy caught his first fox, and that's a memory I'll always treasure.
I'm about to say that sounds like the absolute A, best case scenario, but B, like your dad having the wherewithal to really sink that memory deep into your brain on like the
Yeah,
joy and excitement. I'm curious, with those books you bought, clearly that must have helped, right? Like what you read. Do you remember what piece of advice you took from those books early that you actually implemented that you think might have led to that success? Because truth be told, like most people I talk with, especially when they make the jump from water trapping to canine, myself included, is failure, 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 failure. You seem to have
yes.
like knocked it out of the park right on the first run. So do you remember what you took away from those books that helped?
It's it was just about work, putting in. You just had to keep making fresh sets
Mm,
every day, and that to me that was the most important thing. You would check traps, but always try to take the effort to put in extra sets at the end of the day and keep pushing. Uh, the problem back then was just getting started, having enough traps. Because
mm.
once possum got one dirty or whatever, you had a non-target catch, then I'd pull them and move them. But I like Gerald Weiland's system a lot. His was really no nonsense, and he gave you the basic tools you needed. And it wasn't rocket science, but if you kept gloves on and kept your hands clean and try to be as particular, just kind of follow their recipe and their page book, and you would find success. But the main thing was just having enough ground. And back then, when fur prices were going on, there was a lot of competition for ground, kind of like trying to get deer hunting permission nowadays. Everybody's wanting to do it, and it's just there's only so much ground that it's available. So we luckily had some good friends that were farmers, and some other people. It doesn't take a whole lot of ground to keep a schoolboy trapper happy, and that was me back in that time of my life.
Uh, when you were getting started and you had that gray fox, can you remember like the biggest mistake you made in your first shed the first time?
Oh yeah, skinning the tail out. It's always a tough one. You I kind of boogered up the tail, didn't have a right tail stripper, and didn't peel it down far enough. And you make mistakes like that, but it wasn't anything major. It was just enough to make the tail kind of laid a little wonky, let's call it. And but it wasn't a deal breaker or anything like that.
Did you end up keeping any of those furs from that time, or was it pretty much like, you got them and this was, your schoolboy business and you and your dad were turning it and uh, trying to make a
Well,
little money off of it?
mostly we sold most of it, but there's a really good taxidermist in the area. She works well with the Ohio State Trapper Association. Her husband, Keith Daniels, was the president of the Ohio State Trappers for a lot of time. Her name is Carol Daniels.
Mm.
And I wanted some rugs made. So I had a raccoon rug made from a really big dark raccoon that I caught. But I caught a really nice red fox that had a white foot. I called him Billy Whiteshoe, and I did a full rug with the feet, completely rendered and cleaned out and preserved, and it's beautiful. I still have it to this day.
That's awesome. When you described hearing the chain rattling when you were going up to check that fox trap, and then you described, the frosty morning, you described things like an artist would or an author would. I'm curious, at what point, like, did you start to maybe look at things through an artist's lens? Like, I know we haven't gotten kind of beyond like your school age years, but at what point did you start to really have an eye for like the aesthetics around trapping that might have eventually translated into your career as an artist?
I think it was always there. When it was time to take photos of your catch, a lot of people would just stand up and take it from, chest high. I got down on my belly and wanted to get a bird or a, ground's eye view of that fox, and it just made it so much better for photographs. And you just learn that way. And I started when I was in art school. I was contacted by my local Bluffton News, and they wanted a political cartoonist. And they heard that I was trapping. They heard that I did artwork and was going to art school, and so that's kind of how I got to start as far as um, just getting published and getting out there, and just the whole realm of doing doing artwork, but doing a variety of things, but also bringing in, I tried to work in a little bit of the wildlife and the naturalism of my interest into everything that I did. So I kind of got off on a little bit of a sidetrack there, but anyways,
That, that's perfect though. But like when you were young, you started kind of at the peak of the fur boom,
yes.
and then I mean, I'm going to make an assumption here, and you can tell me if this declarative statement is false or not, that you probably were already starting to find an interest in art at the same time along that way, or find you probably had an affinity for it. But did you keep trapping that whole time between the fur boom and when you went off to art school? Or they
Yes.
have ebbs
Oh
and flows?
yeah. No, I kept trapping, and I would take 2 weeks off during art school, and I try to get ahead of my work, and I would go home and trap because I loved it, and the money was good, and you just weren't going to stop me from it. And a lot of my fellow college student friends were just like, "You're crazy! You're taking 2 weeks off." I'm like, "Yeah, that's what I'm going to do. That's what I love, and it's going to help pay the bills a little bit." And I met a guy named Joe Sorovic. We're both freshmen at Columbus College of Art and Design, and went down his room and saw that he had some traps, and we struck up a friendship, and we started trapping around Columbus, around 270 outer belt for raccoons and muskrats, and we'd get pulled over by the local cops, and they'd say, "Hey, what are you doing?" And we tell them, "Hey, we're setting traps." And once they figured out that we were not a threat or anything, they let us go, and they would occasionally stop us and let it, find out how we did that day. And there we were in art school in a freshman dorm, and having stretched furs in the student the dorm room. And there were a lot of liberal arts students who were not real happy with us whatsoever, that we were, these heathens that were trapping during school year.
Man, I can't imagine that at an art school today. Even then, I imagine you probably got a little bit of pushback. Do you remember any specific instance where somebody was like really put off just by the fact that you trapped?
Yes, yeah, there were a couple of, actually. Well, Joe had a truck that we were trapping out of, and yeah, unfortunately, a couple of the guys in our dorm didn't like that we were trapping and to harvesting these animals. And Joe woke up one Sunday morning, and someone had taken a brick and threw it down through his hood of his truck and boogered it up pretty bad. But we found out who it was, and we we took care of the problem.
Yeah.
So
Under
yeah,
understood, and as it should be, but,
yeah,
yeah, that's pretty interesting to be in art school and, being stretching, tanning. I had um, someone on recently who was in Major League Baseball, and similar story, obviously a little bit more apt towards outdoorsmanship, but, somebody
yeah.
was stretching and, quartering animals within the like, not the dugout, but, like, the locker room, and, you always get the weird looks from people, but,
For sure. Well, people that were raised on a farm that were, in art school, anybody has an ag background, they're used to it. But it's folks that are in the city and the metro areas that are just not raised that way. They're not around it. So it is an absolute shock to them to see, they're used to having their steaks given to them on a white styrofoam plate that's sealed in plastic. So they're totally removed for the responsibility of the death of that animal, and
you know,
it's unfortunate.
it's kind of like a chicken and egg problem. Like, at what point did you really start to get a handle on like the conservation benefits? It sounds like you were doing a lot of farm trapping for
Yeah.
family friends, like, and it sounded like it started as, hey, like, there's a market for this fur. This is
Mhm.
an interest to me. But at what point did you see like, oh, I'm actually having a positive impact on, whatever it was you were trapping for? Like if you're trapping for fox to stop predation of birds, like at what point did that all kind of catch up and you're like, oh, this is actually beneficial conservation work?
It was pretty early on. A lot of the muskrats would really work hard on the banks of these farm fields, and they would go up into the fields, and you'd have farmers complain about ruts and getting you know their vehicles hitting these big ruts and washouts that are caused by animals that are burrowing near the creeks. And you recognize that when you get an over infestation of them, they've got to be kept in check.
Yeah.
So that was really my first introduction to the conservation aspect.
Yeah. And like you said, it feels like it's almost just innate with people with an ag background or even a tangential ag relationship with someone who's a farmer. It's like, yeah, you got to take care of these problems.
Sure.
So you did that throughout college. What year did you graduate?
84.
So the fur market might not have been as hot around that time of graduation,
That's when it
right?
was starting to tank. That
Uh,
was 84 was when things were really starting to tank down.
do you remember what the cause was offhand? Like,
I can't remember. I know that there was, I don't know if it was Russia was buying fur, China was buying fur, and then for some reason, I think Russian economy really, uh, I think it was a political issue that it really tanked. And when that happened, all of a sudden, all the promised, market that they would have brought to the table was just boom, it was gone. And I think China was struggling a little bit back then too. And I
mhm.
think from what I remember, I think that was a big cause, just not having those markets anymore. Their dollar wasn't as strong. But boy,
And
things have changed there, right?
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, and it's flip flopping all over the place. But do
yeah,
you remember when you mentioned it's kind of like deer hunters today trying to find private land to hunt, going and asking for
yeah.
permission? Leading up to 84, there were a lot of trappers. Do you remember like if there was a distinct just drop off at that year of people who just literally hung up their traps, or was it kind of a slow trickle for a few years before, the wheat from the chaff was separated, where
Mhm.
people who are just trapping because they love it versus the people who are trapping for a profit who just stepped away when it became no longer as profitable?
I think it was a pretty good drop off right through there as far as competition. It was a lot easier to get ground to trap, and I still continued to do it for a while. But I did kind of at some point, I love fox trapping, and the fox kind of the numbers kind of the coyote came in about that time. I caught my first coyote. I think it was 1986, 87. And it was one of the, I don't want to say one of the first caught in Ohio, but the DNR made me send the skull, and they were interested in taking measurements to find out if it was a hybrid or if it was a true coyote. And they had told me that as far as reported statistics in the 88 counties of Ohio that year, there were only 44 coyotes that were reported, which to me, that's shockingly low. But it
Mhm.
didn't take long for them to start moving in. And I guess my point is, they kind of took over and kind of beat the fox population back pretty hard. And between that and the value of fox for us not having the population and then only getting $6 or $8 for a fox fur, I kind of just paused a little bit and said, their numbers are down, and I just, that beautiful animal. I just don't want to take an animal when there's really not that many of them right now, and for that small amount of return, just didn't seem right. And that was about the time when I kind of took a turn and really got an interest in bow hunting, and started doing that more and more throughout from that point forward.
Man, isn't that a concept that many people, specifically people who even might hold an anti-hunting, anti-trapping viewpoint, can't wrap their heads around, that somebody like Joe, who's a fox trapper, can take in the information around him and say, you know what? I love this pursuit, but I'm going to put it on hold because I actually love this animal. And I see the numbers
Exactly.
dropping from coyote predation and over trapping or whatever the
Yeah.
case may be. But how do you help people reconcile that? Like when you have that mindset. I think most trappers and hunters
Sure.
do, but how do you explain that to somebody who's on the outside?
Yeah, it's difficult, but it's they need to recognize that there are a lot more people that are involved in the outdoor sports that are, conservation minded and do have. I mean, because if we don't have the creatures to pursue, then there goes our sport and our livelihood, our love. I mean, a lot of people say that bow hunting and trapping is an absolute, it's a way of life. It's an obsession,
Mhm.
and if we don't take care of our ground, if we don't set aside, fawning cover for deer, cover for pheasants and wild birds, we got to keep predators down to have an abundance of rabbits to hunt. It's just there's a lot of factors involved, and I think anybody that has a passion for it can speak to that.
And you mentioned you when you took that break a little bit, and or at least pulled back the throttle on pursuing foxes and trapping for a little while. And you picked up bow hunting. Uh, I kind of had the inverse introduction into the outdoors as you did, where I started in bow hunting and then picked up trapping. And you know, I wish I had done it the other way. Hindsight being what it is, because after becoming a trapper, my hunting has gotten much better. So I'm curious, like from your vantage point, do you think you had a little bit of an advantage going into bow hunting, having been a trapper for so long? And follow on question to that is, does trapping make you a better hunter?
Oh, absolutely. You learned when you're like, just for example, pursuing trapping coyotes, trapping fox. You look at areas where they're going to be running, and you look at intersections, and you look at travel paths. And the same way with deer, you look at it that way, and you get to see, and you get to study when you get a new farm. It's so exciting, and you're like, okay, so where are the animals most likely to be the most often? And that is purely where you want to put your stand. It's also where you want to put your sets if you're trapping. That places where the most foot traffic is going to be, and it's also wind direction. You think about that. You want to be downwind of where they're going to cross so they don't wind you. Whereas trapping, if you're using scents, you want to be upwind. You want them to blow. You want that scent to naturally blow towards that animal and that crossing, and then draw them to it. So all these things are big factors when it comes to, when you have a new farm or place to set up and hunt or trap.
Wow. Yeah, it's a never ending calculus, right? And I do
Oh,
think that the trapping can help beat down that learning curve. And I always encourage people listening, if you're thinking of getting into trapping, do it, especially if you're a hunter already, or if you're a hunter and you want to become a better hunter, get into trapping. It's a
yeah.
great formula get better all around as an outdoorsman, and I
Well,
think
there's a great crossover for both as far as, trapping predators to keep your deer population together. It's trying to keep these species from being overrun and, the predation turkey hunters, the raccoons are, they can just go and just destroy nests after nest after nest. Um, I think I go back to talking to a couple of wildlife officers in the state of Michigan, and they told me about a study that was done back in I think it was the 80s or 90s, is when trail cameras first became a good tool, and they set up a camera on a coyote den, and that female coyote brought back 2 fawns a day for over 2 weeks. Now, how can just do the math on that? How much that one animal impacted that local deer herd? And when
mm,
you bring that to people, even people that don't hunt or don't understand it, they have to realize that, hey, we need to keep these animals in check. There has to be some type of management program implemented and has to be, seen to and
yeah,
followed through with.
100%. And then I actually just had this past week on Idaho's fur bearer biologist, Corey Mosby, and we were talking a lot about conservation. He's like, it's just the importance of trappers specifically on the predator population is so necessary. And a lot of people just don't even recognize that it's a real means of take that is effective, efficient, and largely ethical, to be able to
Yes.
control these different populations and keep that
Mhm.
from happening, or at least mitigate it as much as popular or as possible to have healthy balance, right? We want predators on the
Right,
landscape. We also want our ungulates and other critters to be able to,
right.
thrive as well for both recreation and just for, you know, the joy of looking at them.
Well, for an example, I'm looking out my window here, and we've got a 350-pound corn feeder out here that we can look out and have our coffee in the morning. And we have a lot of bird feeders, and we just like it's into our woods, and we like to watch the wildlife. And we started noticing some raccoons coming in. They started taking our bird feeders down, and so we decided, it's been a couple of falls ago. Let's set some coon traps out and try to thin them down a little bit. So put a couple of box traps out, and 2 coon. Next, took care of them. Reset. Next day, 2 coon. So
Mhm.
well, we're going to need some more traps. Put out 4 traps, 4 coon. And in a 2.5, we've just got 14 acres of woods here. And in 2.5 weeks, we caught over 60 coon in that
Wow.
one location.
That's a
That's
lot.
that's a lot. And those things can do some real damage if they're not kept in check.
Yeah.
So that was astonishing to me that I never would have dreamed we would have had those numbers in this small location.
Yeah. Without that balance, without that
Yeah.
check,
Yep.
it will explode. And that's something I wish a lot of people outside of the trapping and hunting community could get their hands, wrapped around a little bit. Uh,
Sure.
but 84, 85 fur market kind of drops out. You step back a little bit, you start bow hunting more. You got started in your involvement with fur fish and game and creating artwork, what, around 87?
86 was the first piece I got published, and I'll never forget it. It was a saltwater fishing piece,
Oh, really?
and it was black and white, pen and ink. And I had been reading fur fishing game since I was 12 years old or younger, and always saw the illustrations. The covers were beautiful, but inside illustrations, a lot of times there was a lot left to be desired. And it was 1985, 86. I was in Columbus, and Fur Fishing Game, the offices were not far from my school.
Hmm.
I called them up and I said, "Look, my name's Joe Goodman. I'm a longtime trapper, and I'm a artist at the art school here. I know the difference between a coil spring and a conibear, and I just wondered if you guys would ever consider hiring someone steady to illustrate these stories that you have. I feel like I could do a good job." And I talked with the editor at the Times, and it was Ken Dunwoody, and he said, we were just talking about getting someone that would be
Hmm.
stats that could contribute. Why don't you bring your work in and we'll take a look and we'll see. So I brought in some illustrations and met with them, and they said, "Well, you're really good. We like what we see. Here's 2 stories. You got 2 weeks,
Hmm.
and we'll see how it goes." So I knocked out those 2 illustrations, and the one was the saltwater piece, and I've had artwork in every single issue since. The saltwater piece, I'll never forget it, opening up that magazine and seeing my name at the lower right corner, Jay Goodman. And you were talking earlier about driving that gray fox around town. It was another moment similar to that I was able to take that magazine around and show some dear friends. I remember Ron Bush. It was a fellow that was a trapper and a good friend of ours, taught me how to trap my first fox. And I opened up that page, and he saw the drawing, but he didn't see the name. And then I
Hmm.
pointed to the Jay Goodman, and I think he got a little choked up,
Huh.
and that was pretty cool to see. So, yeah, that was a defining moment for me in my career.
That's amazing. How is that how the relationship worked with that and other publications you've contributed to where they have authors or trappers or whomever write stories and then it's a quick turnaround. It's like, hey Joe, we got this monthly, quarterly magazine coming out. Here's 5, 10, 20 stories I need you to read. And then is it you picking like what you want out of the written text to be depicted in an illustration? Like, how does that work? I'm curious.
I would go in, magazines usually are 2 months out.
Okay.
So when we're working on the December issue of Fur Fishing Game, I'm in there in early October.
Mm,
And I would go in and I'd meet with the editor. Mitch Cox ended up being the editor that I worked with the longest there. And typically he would call me up and say, "Hey, because they buy stories from writers all across the country, across the world. And if that writer is a good photographer and provides good photos that illustrate that story well, they just go with the photos.
mhm,
But when it comes to some trapping techniques and set illustrations and anything specific or mechanical, then it needs an illustration to actually. A lot of people, the written word isn't always so great as far as illustrating in practice how to do these things. And a lot of these are how to stories. And so I would meet with Mitch, and he'd say, "Well, I kind of have this idea. Here we go. We've got an otter slide set, and there's a conibear. It's got to be slightly submerged." And I'm picturing a side view of the otter coming down and showing the proper way to anchor it and how it would sit. And that would be one typical illustration that I would do. And occasionally there was feature artwork where, for example, Charles Dobbins wrote a lot of articles on trap modification. He was a very well thought of, important member of the industry. And they were doing a feature on Charles, and they wanted me to do an illustration of Charlie. Well, I'd never met him.
hmm,
And they gave me his phone number, and I called him up out of the blue, and I said, "Charlie, it's Joe Goodman. I'm staff artist over at Fur Fishing Game, and I've never met you, never seen you, but I was wondering, we were thinking about doing a full page drawing of you at your workbench working on traps. Could you maybe take some pictures, have some pictures taken of you and send them to me? And maybe hang some furs up behind you." And I kind of gave him exactly what I wanted. And back in, I think this was early '90s when we did this one. And I about a week later, I got this packet of beautiful black and white photographs because I asked him if he could do black and whites, even though it was a little more expensive at the time to convert the color to black and white. And he did these perfect setups
hmm.
for me. And so I did this illustration of Charlie, full page drawing, and I started a relationship with him. And I ended up getting doing articles for his books or illustration covers for his books. A lot of his trapping videos I've done the artwork for. And when he passed away, his son Paul Dobbins, who started Charlie actually started the Trapper Man trapping forum, which is
Mhm.
becoming a very famous and great group, an important area of the trapping community where people gather to discuss trapping. Paul saw me at a trapping show, and he called me over to look at his camera. And this was a year after Charlie had passed away. And so he pointed on the viewfinder of his camera, and it was this drawing that I did for Charlie. It was kind of a trio of a coon, a mink, and a muskrat for Charlie's water trapping video. But it looked really weird. It was gray, and he said, "Well, back out, zoom out a little bit on that." And I zoomed out, and it was Charles Dobbins' gravestone, and they had my artwork etched on his gravestone. And just what an honor! I got choked up. I had to walk away, and that just you just never know when you the relationships that you make in this industry and just how important they're going to be down the road for
You
you.
know, it's like you knew the questions I was going to ask. I'm actually going to skip the next one that I had to get to this one because it's perfectly aligned with what you're talking about now. And it's, you know, how much does camaraderie play in modern trapping and its long term success?
Well, you early on, there's so much competition. Guys come out with their own lure, they come out with their own methods, and competition is a great driving factor. But camaraderie is even more important because we're up against a big fight. People are trying to take away our rights. And I think that a lot of people need to hang up the old um, competition thing and think about how much unity we should be displaying because we need each other. We have way more in common than we have, you know, uh, differences. And I just think for us as a community, we need to come together, and we are. It's trappers have really come together, and the associations are so important to be members of, and that they fight so many political bills that are anti-trapping bills that want to take away our rights. And I don't know if I answered your question or not, but just what I've seen in the beginning, seemed like there was just a lot of guys would always be kind of leery of other guys and everyone trying to be the best at what they do. And I get that. That's kind of the American way. But there's also a time when you need to set aside that and say, hey, we need to band together because we are stronger together than we are separate.
Yeah, and you've been to a lot of conventions, I mean, over the years, but even this past year, what would you say from visiting those that gives you promise for kind of having that like banded together, like, hey, we have more in common than we do differences. Like, let's fight the same fight. What is it about those conventions that you see that gives you kind of hope for the future of trapping?
What has astounded me over the last 10 years, 15, 20 years, let's just look at the fur market where it really started dying in 80s, 90s. And the fur market has been really, if you want to say, in the toilet, for lack of a better, for a long time. And what astonishes me is the amount of people that still show up and attend and support these trappers conventions despite the fur market. The people, I've got a new t-shirt out called Die Hard Trapper because there's those guys that are dyed in the wool. That's what they love to do and they're going to continue to do. And just the support and amount of people that still come out to the shows and attend and support the vendors, it's been astonishing to me that throughout the hardest of times with this market, that there still is a great support and love for this industry.
And the history too is always what
Oh
gets me.
yeah,
Like, it's such a deep rooted beyond just American, but like, I always go back to this is what our country was founded on, whether it's
sure,
the fur trade, like
yeah,
it is so you can't separate our country from the fur market.
no, you cannot. It's And that's what I love. A lot of my early pieces, I started doing mountain man portraits because that was my interest, and it's just it truly is they opened and settled and explored the West. They were the trappers, and they settled this land, and they were, you know, breakers and pathfinders, and they they broke the ground to the Great West, and that's part of our history that I'm very proud of, and any trapper identifies with. The old movie Jeremiah Johnson, where he goes out west to get away from civilization and be a free man. It's just so many of us just really gravitate and just love that movie, and it's just something that's in the heart of all of us.
And for people who might be interested in trapping, like obviously the days of Jeremiah Johnson are largely gone. You can still go to the Mountain West. You can still go out. You can come out to my area and trap and not run into anybody. And you get that feeling of being in a time capsule. But for people who are interested in trapping, like, do you believe they can still get a lot of that benefit of that feeling of being a free man, even if you're doing like coon sets in your backyard or, what have you? Like, would you still encourage people today to get into trapping, even if the
Oh,
lore of the West is long gone?
absolutely. Being able to just get outside, even if there's buildings and structures around, you still got trees, you've got waterways, you've got creeks, you've got beautiful settings. And there's just something about making a set and being with nature. It makes me, feel closer to God than I ever have been in any church at any time. I
Mhm.
just love the outdoors, and that's where I feel closer to my maker when I'm out there. And it wouldn't take anybody long to get out and get your feet wet, get your boots muddy, and whether you're in an urban setting or not, you're still going to have that feeling, and you get the joy of enjoying tapping into the outdoors.
And for somebody who is new, if you had a piece of advice to give them to get started, what would that be?
Knock on doors and just start making relationships. If that means you got a small piece of property and someone says, hey, someone else is hunting it, they don't want you out there, well, would you let me squirrel hunt? Try to get in by just doing very limited things like that, and you start making that relationship. Go back and thank them at the end of the year. Bring them, some jerky or some kind of a token of appreciation, and that person, life's change, and maybe they will the next year let you trap.
Mm,
And just don't stop. Just keep knocking on doors, making those relationships, and buy more traps.
yep. That's
keep
one thing.
keep buying more traps. It's you can never have enough. Despite what my wife says and other people's wives say, you can always having a few extra traps around just get you in the mood to get out after it.
Yeah, I think that might be a clip we have to cut here for all the trap manufacturers. They're gonna be like, "Look, everybody go listen to Joe. No
That's
matter
right.
what happens, go buy more traps." Yeah, my wife would agree with your wife that she thinks there probably is a limit, but my woodshed, everything else, there's plenty of nailing space to get more traps out and hang them
Right.
up. So I'm with you on that one. Um, You've also been involved, like, with your illustrations and artwork with a lot of books. I've obviously read Tom Miranda's Master Trappers. There's been, like the New York State Trapper Association, their involvement with some of those books. Like, how did you start to kind of go from, magazines in the outdoor space to individuals who are producing books?
It's just as an illustrator, you're always looking for work, and I was illustrating. People would hit me up while just getting my name out there in fur fishing game. They would call the magazine, say, "Hey, this guy that's been doing work for you, I like his work. I got a book, trapping book." So I've illustrated a number of trapping books over the years. I've done stuff for Gary Jepson, and I've done a lot of stuff for Divisions of Wildlife, where they're publishing their trapping methods or their trapping regulations. I did illustrated for the International Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies did a big BMP study on best management practices and how, how effective different types of traps were. And I'm very proud to be part of that whole process. And, that's something that is international, worldwide, and, seen by a lot of different people. But, I have a friend from Michigan that got his trapping regulations, and he called me up and he said, "Hey, I saw your illustrations in our trapping regs. That's pretty cool. I didn't know you were doing that." And I'm like, yeah, it's just whenever the phone rings, you never know what opportunity is going to be awaiting. And I try to do a variety of things. Just anymore as I get older, I try to do something that's. Anyways, did I lose you, Zach?
You did, but we're back in
Okay,
absolutely no time, so that's perfect.
good.
I'm curious. We talked a little bit about like the history, but like trapping has such like a visceral feel to it. Like, what is it about the activity and the legacy that makes it so, I don't want to say easy to replicate, but so good as a replication to something in an illustration? Like, you look at a trapping photo or a mountain man photo or illustration, and you're just like, you're sucked back into time. Like, what is it about the elements that come together that make it so good for an artist to render?
Well, there's a lot of factors. If I've got anything about fox trapping or trapping in general, if it could even be just the type of trap that's portrayed. If it's one of my favorites was the old Northwoods Bridger style double, coil spring. I love those traps. But just reading the illustration, reading the story, and then picturing myself in that author's mind and what he is trying to show, to teach new trappers, showing them his methods and what is the best way for me to do that. That gets my juices going. And like, okay, how can I show this so it's easy to understand, that somebody that's brand new to this can look at this illustration and say, okay, in that paragraph, that's what this guy was talking about. Because a lot of times words just don't translate. And just jumping in, and but also making it realistic, showing something that's like, okay, that person that's reading this 10 o'clock at night in their bed before they go to sleep, and they're excited about trapping. I want to be able to let their mind transport them to their local creek or their local farm where they're trapping, and be able to implement that author's idea and be successful. That's what gets me going.
I'm sure there's so many people listening to this because everybody I've talked to, everybody pretty much subscribes to Fur Fish Game. So I am sure there are people listening to this that are like, damn, thanks, Joe. Like, that was that situation where I was sleeping in bed at 10 p.m. or about to go to bed. And
Oh yeah.
it took me into dreamland, and then I got up and implemented it. But I got a question as it relates to all those educational illustrations that you have done over the
Mhm.
years. Is there one you remember that you read and did an illustration for that just like blew your mind on maybe the simplicity or just the way that it was implemented that you also actually took out to your line?
Well, I remember the bottom edge set. Ken Smythe was a trapper, I believe, up in Michigan. And the simplicity of his bottom edge set that he would use in a variety of locations, but under bridges, it's really common. And it's just so simple. And you just, we never had a whole lot of mink around where I was, but I thought it was a very cool animal. They're little mini otters, and they're so cool. And just to boil it down to so simple of, and just knowing that that animal by its nature follows that same edge no matter where they go. And if you can find that type of spot, you're going to have success. And that one always resonated with me. And started using it, and just like, you wouldn't think, but when you put it down and you put that trap in there, boom, there they are. It's it's amazing.
Yes.
So
Now, as we kind of come up here on time, we're already almost up on an hour, but I kind of always ask the same last questions. And The first one is you've had a lifetime out in the woods. You've had a lifetime of illustrating and reading about other people's time in the woods. What's the wildest thing you've ever experienced outdoors?
Well, I was bow hunting in southwest Columbus, and I'm up in a tree stand, and it was like a parade of deer.
Hmm.
There was a hot doe come running through, beautiful day like today, and it was late October. Leaves were turning. Had a nice layer of leaves on the woods floor, and you could hear them coming, the crunching, the hooves beating those leaves. And this hot doe comes running through right by my stand. And this was first couple 3 years of my getting serious about bow hunting. And in runs this spike right on her trail. Then behind him, 4 point, and then behind him a 6 point, then behind him an 8 point. And each buck that came in that line, there were like 7 or 8 deer following this doe. And then there was a 10 point, and it was a one of those marbled, I can't think what it's called, with the white, oh gosh, what's the name of that marking on, I can't think of it right now, but it's got the white color marbling in their body. I can't think of the name of the type of deer that it is, but I'd never seen one in the wild, and it was just so cool to see that and see that parade of deer going by. And I'm just like, wow, that was one of the coolest uh, displays of the rut that I had ever seen in my life. And the last deer was this really nice big 10 point coming through. And it's just so funny how each deer got bigger following this doe.
Yeah, did you end up pulling and drawing back on any of those?
It happened so fast, I had no time whatsoever. I think I was caught with my pants down and just in awe of the whole situation. That's where my mind was blown, and I was I absolutely total fail. So yeah, but I did kill one out of that same stand just a few days later. But I tell you what, though, a similar thing, only in trapping, that blew my mind. A situation, and I still don't to this day don't know exactly what happened. But I was trapping underneath this bridge, and I called it the coon condo because the raccoons just had just all kinds of paths through there. There's about 2 foot deep of water, but the bottom was solid concrete
Hmm.
with a little layer of mud. And so there was no way to anchor. I was wanting to make two pocket sets and make a slide wire down to a big rock weight. So that's what I used, a big rock weight, and I wired around it. And then I ran 2 slide wires up, and the 2 pocket sets were probably 10 to 12 feet apart.
Hmm.
But when the trap would go off, they would slide down to that rock, and they would drown. Well, I drove over this set, and I was catching a coon a day, etc. Well, then I saw a little small hump floating, and I had something. So I walked down there, and I picked up, and it was this beautiful big buck mink, and he was in both traps.
Oh, wow.
How did that happen? I can't, how, and these were 15 feet apart. How did that happen? How did that mink get in both traps? And they were staked solid up by the pocket, tight slide wire down to that rock. And the only thing I can think of is that mink was fighting that trap and vibrated the other trap downward to him and somehow got in it. But it was one of the most bizarre things to this day. I don't know for sure how that happened, but that was just so mind blowing. And I just told somebody about that at the Ohio State show. Try to get these trappers' opinions. What do you think happened? And they all kind of said
That's
the
an
same thing.
illustration we need to see.
There you go. That would be a good one.
Yeah. Oh. And then the last question I always ask is always a hypothetical, always a hard one. You have to make a choice. So you could either have unlimited trapping year round for Joe Goodman. You have access to all the traps you want, all the critters you want, all over the state, all over the world for that matter. But in order to get that, you have to give up doing artwork for the rest of your life. Or you could give up, or you could be the most famous artist on the planet, but in order to do that, you have to give up trapping for the rest of your life. What would you choose and why?
I would have to say I would have to give. I've spent a lot of decades trapping. I've really done a lot and enjoyed it, but giving up my artwork, that's what I'm meant to do. And it's actually a pretty easy choice for me, just
All
because
right.
I've had the experience of trapping and I've enjoyed it to its fullest. And it is a tough question, but in my mind, clicked pretty quickly to the one where, yeah, because that's who I am for sure, and I could still enjoy it through others,
That's
but
true.
you know, but
Wow. It's
artwork.
a fair
I think
choice.
I think if I didn't do artwork, it'd be a waste of talent that I was given by our maker. So that's what I'm meant to do.
And then the last question, what do you see as the future of trapping? If Joe Goodman has his magic 8 ball and shakes it, what do you see our future as?
Well, there's always going to be a need, and there's a lot of wide open spaces out there still that you know natural outdoor trapping will continue, although damage control when it comes to urban areas is going to be the key to the populated areas. That's where people are going to be able to thrive and still trap, um, because there's going to be a need, because there's just not enough of generation of new folks that are not raising their kids to be agricultural and to know how to handle. They get freaked out when there's a mouse in the house, let alone a bat or a raccoon or whatever the case may be. So the future is still strong. Like I said, there's a lot of wide open spaces out there that are left, and with places to go and to do our beloved sport. But certainly, damage control, nuisance control is always going to have its place, and it's going to be even stronger in the future. That's where the future is headed for sure.
I like the optimism. Joe, I appreciate it. I have learned a ton. I really do value your time and everything you shared with me. Where can people find out more about your work, specifically your artwork, and how can people? I mean, other than picking up fur, fish, game, old copies, but where can people learn more about you if they don't already know?
Well, contact me at joegoodmanprints.com. And when you Google Joe Goodman, my website is the first thing that comes up on Google. So I'm pretty easy to find. Same website I've had for years. And there's contact information on the website. You can always call me. And I'm not just artist, I'm secretary and shipper. And I've learned long ago, though, that I'm a much better artist than I am a secretary. So bear with me on some orders that I might make a mistake on occasionally, but I think they forgive me for the most part.
Perfect. Well, Joe, again, I appreciate it. And for everybody listening, we'll catch you on another episode of the Okayest Trapper podcast.
Thank you, Zach. I enjoyed it.